President Bush has said that we're at war and that he is a wartime president. Is this a political ploy, or are we really in a new sort of age where terrorism isn't a new kind of Cold War and the President's role as Commander-in-Chief is central and ongoing?
Okay, well, I'll take it. Can you hear me? Yeah.
They set it up that way.
It's okay. I've got a bad cold, so if things get too rough, I'll lose my voice. I think that's part of a very major answer, because a lot of what the answer is depends on what you believe about the situation. From what I know of George W. Bush, he would not say that unless he meant it. If you believe that terrorism is a very serious business, that, as many people believe, it is equivalent to a war, then de facto, he is a war president. Same way Roosevelt was a war president, in the sense that whoever unluckily gets to be in that position gets to make all the decisions during a time when we as a nation are under attack. Now, some people are going to argue that, hey, we're not under attack and that he's not a war president. Or maybe he didn't mean it when he said it. But I think from what we know about him, he and many other people believe we are, and he meant it.
Susan, let me ask you a follow-up to that. The 9/11 Commission and events in Iraq have focused attention on Bush as Commander-in-Chief in this role. A lot of the political consultants, Dick Morris among them, say if voters are focused on terrorism on Election Day, that Bush will win. If their gaze is on economic issues, Kerry will prevail. Does Bush benefit from this focus on the war, whether the news is good or bad?
Until at least a week or so ago, I would have said yes, but it seems to me that the amount of publicity and the amount of the look at the White House that we are getting, both through the 9/11 Commission and through the books that have, most recently the Bob Woodward book, that come out, go to questions that are different from just wartime president. They go to questions of credibility, they go to questions of competence. So it seems to me that even if the focus remains terrorism, to the extent Kerry is able to suggest that Bush is incompetent and that his policies have been ones of deception of the American public, indeed of his own staff, that Kerry's chances get better.
Joe Klein, you spent some time with Bush, and he talks about his foreign policy goals in rather sweeping terms, like preemptive wars, exporting democracy, and now he says he's changing the world. And you've written about Bush's domestic policy, that it represents a similar sort of utopian conservatism, I think you called it. Has Bush gone overboard with the vision thing?
Yeah, I think he has. You know, I mean, utopian conservatism is the weirdest thing that I've ever seen. And in fact, there's a confusion, a stylistic confusion in this campaign as well. You have Bush, who is nominally the conservative, who has taken all of these radical positions. I mean, you know, in my day, way back when, someone who believed in fiscal responsibility was a conservative. Someone who believed in the traditions of diplomacy was a conservative. You know, I think that this is a radical, and he's a visionary, and he has the kind of broad, sweeping idealism that conservatives always used to hate about liberals. Meanwhile, John Kerry, on the other side, is one of the most cautious, traditional, least, I dare say, courageous politicians I've ever seen. And so you've had this complete turnabout, and I'm finding it very, very confusing.
Dave Brady, you've looked at questions of ideology and party alignment. There have been a lot of press reports recently about goings-on in the Republican Party, not too favorable for Bush. This morning there was a quote from Richard Viguerie saying that recent events suggest, and I quote, "It doesn't look like the White House is as astute as we once thought they were," unquote. A recent editorial in the National Review describes the White House as having, quote, "a dismaying capacity to believe its own public relations," unquote. And David Brooks noted conservative exasperation in a recent column in the New York Times, saying that the administration's inability to execute its policies semi-competently has conservatives very worried. Does the president have a problem among conservatives or just in his party generally?
Well, until Kerry's no, not really. The conservatives will vote for him against John Kerry. So in the Republican Party, there is concern about the budget. There's concern about constraints on tariffs. There's the notions you have added 55,000 employees. So there's that series of things. And, of course, the question of Iraq. But in order for the conservative base to go away, you'd have to say, why are they going to vote for Kerry? And frankly, I don't see much of a reason for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Let me stay with Iraq for a moment. The 9/11 Commission Chairman, Republican Tom Keene, has said the Commission's final report this summer will find that the September 11th attacks were preventable. Ron Brownstein of the LA Times and others have suggested, on the other hand, that in this year's election, most Americans will probably judge Bush more on his response to September 11th than in his actions before then. How are the Commission's findings likely to affect the presidential race and Bush's role as a war president? And I invite anyone to respond. Here.
I think there's a kind of synergy between the two. You know, a month and a half ago, the president's handling of 9/11 wasn't an issue at all. It wasn't on anybody's radar screen. And now 40% of the public, according to polls, you got to figure it's a sizable minority, think that he handled it poorly. And I think that if the impression, as Susan said before, if the impression grows that this hasn't been a president who, that this is a president who thinks in these broad sweeping terms but doesn't do the detail work, grows, I think that he could be in some trouble. But I think far more important than these kind of theoretical formulations are going to be events on the ground. You know, we've just experienced a primary campaign that lasted, as far as I could tell, about 5 days. I mean, and literally they were the 5 days before the Iowa precinct caucuses. Everything after that was a ratification. I wouldn't be surprised if the general election lasts only 5 days as well. And so I find myself at a loss to tell you exactly how things are going to play out, but I think that there's a deep level of concern right now and very, very mixed feelings about the war. And I think the way people vote on that is going to depend on the way it looks on Election Day.
Yeah, let me just add to that. As of today, there's 197 days left to go. If you go back and look at past elections, I think you'll be amazed at what people were predicting 197 days before any of those elections. Right. It's amazing how fast one of the fascinating things about politics is things change very, very, very rapidly. And we have a lot to do with what's going to happen in Iraq. Nobody knows at this point. They have plans. They know what they want to do on both sides. What's going to happen to the economy? Nobody really knows until we actually measure the numbers. Probably the worst people to ask are the economists, because they don't know either. No one has been predicting what's been happening. I think what we're in, this is going to be a very interesting, tough election. Things will change. The polls will change. And right now, it's very close.
Let me ask you about one thing that is supposed to happen before the election. That's the June 30th date for transferring power, or sovereignty, excuse me, to the Iraqis. A number of people, including the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Richard Lugar, have questioned whether this is premature. Let me ask you a specific question, but also sort of a general question about Bush's style in office. One, can Bush hold to that schedule, and what's the impact if he backs off? He's been very, very committed. Some people would say he's stubborn. Other people would say that he's diligent and dedicated. But he's also shown an inclination recently with Condi Rice, for example, to say there's no way she's going to testify. Then when it looks as though there's a political pay problem if she doesn't, he says, okay, she will testify. What's going to happen with the handoff? What happens? What does that mean to Bush? What's the impact if he does back off and put it off?
He already pulled a Condi Rice with it. I mean, you know, what you saw last week was Bush adopting John Kerry's Iraq policy, turning it over to Brahimi. And I was, last week, I started the week, it was like when Marty said, I started the week incredibly pessimistic about Iraq, and now I'm
Mildly pessimistic.
I'm seriously pessimistic. Because the plan that Brahimi came up with, you could see how it would, it was essentially he came up with a plan that would have a prime minister, a president, and two, kind of vice chairs. And I could see someone like Ali al-Hakim as the prime minister, and he's the leading Shiite. And you could see Pachachi, who is the, the kind of Sunni, the leading Sunni, which isn't to say much because the Sunnis haven't been involved in this at all, as the president. He also has a foreign policy background. And then you throw a couple of, a Kurd and someone else in as the vice chairs, and then and the big question becomes: are you handing this over to a government or just to a committee? And that has to do with whether or not there are actually bureaucracies in place and all these 25 agencies that can work and can do things. But I think that that's a more plausible plan than turning it over to the governing council. The president made that adjustment. I thought it was a really appropriate and smart adjustment to make. And in some ways, he's taken that issue out from under John Kerry, because what can Kerry say now?
Well, who can predict? You can make one general statement that if things go badly on the ground after June, it hurts Bush. You can imagine a circumstance in which what happens is, by some miracle, nothing happens until November 20th or something, and they capture Osama bin Laden. That helps him. But sitting here and making predictions about which of those two events is going to occur, who the hell knows?
No.
Can I just-
If I knew, I wouldn't be here. I'd be
We
rich.
also should pull back a little bit. Go ahead, Susan.
I just want to say, before we sort of become too fatalistic about this, nothing that anybody has said here should stop ordinary people from asking very basic questions about how this White House and how this particular president ran policy. This is a guy, with an MBA, right? He did it all the corporate way. Well, it turns out that model of running the White House, I guess, is open to some question. I think that nothing we say here about the inevitability of what does or doesn't happen in Iraq, or what does or doesn't happen in the economy, should erase questions about a budget deficit, about an economy where you still have huge amounts of unemployment and no particular plans for adjustment for those sectors of the economy, and about the handling of terrorism.
Dave, you've taught MBA students. Any comment on that model for running the White House?
I have the highest respect for Haas MBA students.
Let me say, I've also taught MBA students, and I don't know anyone that runs it by the book.
Could I say a couple of points on what you said, Susan? I think that it is one of the overwhelming stupidities of Democratic Party politics that they continually badmouth the American economy, which always proves all the badmouthers wrong. I think that given the amount of stimulus that the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve has thrown into the economy, it would be shocking if things didn't improve. I think that the long-term question, mostly to do with the retirement of my generation, is an important one, and I also think that the other important basic question goes to the one that Marty was asked at the very beginning, which is this a war? And if so, what war is it? I tend to believe that we are in a mortal conflict with Islamic radicalism, but that, George W. Bush has been fighting the wrong war in the wrong way, with the most simplistic and notions of what the enemy is and how you go about doing it. So I think that is, I don't know whether an election actually ever gets to a question that is that basic or abstract, but I certainly would like to see it. I mean, everybody I talk to in the intelligence community and in the uniformed military believe that the Iraq operation has created far more terrorists and potential terrorists in the world than it's done away with. I cannot think of I can't. See, Marty, there's your first
hold your
Berkeley
applause,
applause.
please.
But I can't think of, we were talking before about the fact that Osama bin Laden wants to see Bush reelected. I don't blame him. I mean, Bush has given Osama every last thing he would have wanted, including a crusade.
Okay, let me just comment on that. I think it's only fair. I know he talks a lot of... Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. He talks to a lot of people in Washington, and I'm sure the people that he talked to in the military did say that. But I talked to a lot of people in Washington, too, and they say just the opposite. Now, one of the things that's very clear here...
My people are better than your people.
Let me just finish now.
You should get them here, then.
Let me just finish. It seems that one of the things that somebody a long time ago told me that when you're running in a campaign, you always focus on your candidate. He said that's a great mistake because it's between two candidates. It depends on the other candidate. So whenever we ask a question, like we should have a brilliant way of fighting a war against radical Islamists all over the world, et cetera, the question will be raised, fine, what is it? And who's going to do it? And anytime you want to raise a question about what Bush has done or is doing now, it's only fair to ask, fine, what is Kerry going to do and how is he going to do it? Because that's your choice, and it's a choice you must make, and it's going to be a very difficult one.
Well, I think that the basic difference here is, the implication is that even though he voted for the war, Kerry would have been more patient with the UN inspection process, which, by the way, proved to be totally responsible and accurate, and that if he had gone to war, he would not have gone to war unless you could have gotten, a much broader coalition on our side, or unless there was much clearer evidence that Saddam Hussein actually had some active stuff going on there. It's easy to say that in hindsight, but knowing the two of them, that's my judgment. And by the way, I say that as someone who disagreed with every vote that John Kerry has taken on Gulf wars, past and present. I would have voted for the first Gulf War. I would have voted against this Gulf War, and I would have voted for the $87 billion.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my old professors at MIT. He said, when you get out and get away from the school, you're going to hear a lot of answers the scrambled eggs answer. If we had some ham, we could have some scrambled eggs and ham if we had some ham. Now, this is all true, but the question that has to be raised is, what is Bush going to do? Not what he has done, primarily. I want to know what he's going to do in the future. What is he going to do on June 30th? What's going to happen? What kind of a program is he going to put forward? And then I think we should ask the same question about John Kerry. What are you going to do? Let's find out.
Let me ask you a question about one of the things he's been talking about doing, which is trying to get the UN more involved. What about the UN involvement? They don't seem to be terribly willing to come in. Our relations with Europe, old and new, don't seem terrific. The Spanish troops are pulling out. How does that change the equation? What's the likelihood that the UN will come in?
Well, I think first thing we ought to do is run the analysis of how many billions of dollars somebody stole in there, and then we can go from there.
He's talking about the UN management of the Oil for Food program, and it was a tremendous ripoff. There's no question about that, and there are grave doubts about whether or not the UN could actually run something resembling the Coalition Provisional Authority, although the CPA has been so terrible that I imagine almost anybody could run it. The Three Stooges could. I mean,
Both statements are true.
There's a more basic issue here. It's, why the hell are we there? Why the hell did we go into Iraq in the first place when there was a real serious war to be fought? Now, the President said 3 days after September 11th that we are at war against against the terrorists and those who finance them and harbor them. The country in the world that does the most to finance terrorism and has for the past 20 years is Saudi Arabia. The country in the world that harbors the most terrorists is Pakistan. Those are our allies. Now, I realize that it wouldn't have been nearly as cathartic in a macho sort of way to not invade Iraq, but to do the painstaking work of rolling up cell after cell after cell and going after the miscreants in the Pakistani military who created the Taliban and support them still, and doing the kind of special ops works that needed to be done both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, and sitting on the Saudis and their funding of, Bob Graham says that it's going to be proven before long that they directly funded most, if not all, of the 19 hijackers. Now, once we did all that, and by the way, made a more honest and vigorous effort to solve the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, then we could have turned to Saddam Hussein and said, "What's up with you, fella?" But we would have had the world on our side, and we would have had the correct set of priorities. I think that if Bush can be faulted for anything, it is by taking this simple Manichaean view of the world and needing this military catharsis when one was not called for at that moment.
Okay, let me just make a point here. That's a very interesting, comprehensive analysis. But it forgets one thing that, maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seemed to me that after 9/11, Bush invaded a country, what was its name? Afghanistan. Remember that one?
And didn't finish the job.
No, wait.
Why on earth, if he invaded Afghanistan, didn't he have the
Let me
chance to
ask you please not to applaud. This
He
is the
invaded
popularity
Afghanistan,
contest.
and if you want to talk about the Bush program, you also have to talk about why he went into Afghanistan, what was going on there, and what at the time, the reading was on where the source of the terrorism was coming from. And he was the first president that went in and took care of it. And I think you should, whatever you're talking about, what Bush
Absolutely.
did, don't leave it out like you did.
No, I think that's right. I think that, but I think that if Ralph Nader were president, he would have gone into Afghanistan. It was a slam dunk
I know
at that
Ralph
point.
Nader better than that.
But the question.
That is really bad judgment.
The question is the question is why, when he went into Afghanistan, was he so impatient? Why did he begin moving special forces units out to Iraq before the job was done? Why, when Osama bin Laden and the leadership of al-Qaeda was surrounded at Tora Bora, did he allow paid Afghan warlord armies, militias, to try and finish the job? And of course they were paid off by al-Qaeda and they slipped away, rather than putting in the 10th Mountain Division to do the job.
You want the answer?
Why?
Because he wasn't talking to you.
Could we go on?
They didn't.
Really great retrospect.
It seems to me that at the time I talked to both John Kerry and John McCain, who were talking to a great many people at the Pentagon who were saying, this is crazy, we should have sent in the 10th Mountain Division, and those guys at the Pentagon are very risk averse. And in fact, the problem with President Bush is that he doesn't talk to much of anybody, and he certainly doesn't ask them questions.
Let me bring this a little closer to home if I can, and talk about regime change, which is coming up very shortly here. And the Democrats face a difficult time across the country. Marty, you had talked about the situation in terms of Democratic and Republican representation. Could you go through that very briefly, and then I'd like to ask Dave to comment on what he thinks that may look like after the election.
Yeah. We had a discussion of this at the dinner we just had, and they disagreed with me, but I'll try it on you. I think there's something much more important in this election than Iraq or the economy. And for some reason, no one seems to be talking about it. If you look at this country, the real question is who is going to govern the country? Who is running the country? Who's going to be making the major decisions? Now, I've known almost the last 30, 40 years, the Democrats have largely been doing this. But something has happened, and no one wants to talk about it. There are 6 basic power groups in this country. You've got the presidency, you've got the House of Representatives, probably the most important one, you've got the Senate, you've got the Supreme Court, you've got all the governors, and you've got the state legislatures. Now, what has happened very quietly last year, and is in effect today, and let me run through it. Every one of those 6 basic points are controlled by Republicans. The White House has a Republican there. And the way I get into this, I made believe I was a Democrat. And I looked at the fact that the White House is being run by a Republican. And I figured, well, they probably kind of stole it down in Florida. And then I look at the Senate, and boy, the Senate now is under the control of the Republicans. Then I look at the House. 1994, Newt Gingrich and his group of people won an astonishing victory in the House. Everybody I talked to, including Republicans, were amazed and thought it was, maybe lasted 2 years and that was it. But it didn't. It came back again and again and again. And right now, there's no hope of the Democrats taking back the House. Now let's go to the Supreme Court. It's critical who appoints the people on the Supreme Court. And for some time now, 7 out of the 9 have been appointed by Republicans. This started back with Richard Nixon, when it went to 6-3. Then under Ford, it went to 7-2, and it's been that way for almost 30 years. In fact, in terms of appointing the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, it's been 50 years since the Democrats have appointed a Chief Justice. Now let's look at the state legislatures. This year, for the first time in a long time, the majority of the state legislatures are in the hands of Republicans. And finally, governors. The majority of the states are in the hands of Republicans, including the big states, the populous ones, New York, Texas, Florida. And then to add insult to injury, the Republicans came out here last year and they kicked out a governor. Yeah, the Democrats had the biggest state in the union. Very proud of it. And they replaced him with, oh my dear God, an actor. And to add insult to injury, he's a very popular actor. Now, all I'm suggesting is that at this stage in history, for the first time in 35 or 40 years, the Republicans control all 6 of those points. Now, I know a lot of Democrats, and they have half the votes in this country, and they think something's wrong. This is not fair. They got nothing. And if the Republicans do what they want to do, which is to win a more majority in the House, and particularly a higher majority in the Senate, you know what they're going to do then? They are going to appoint a lot of very young, good, smart Republicans to judges all over the United States. So it's very important who wins this. If the Democrats lose this battle this fall, they may be tipped into becoming a minority party for a long, long time to come.
Dave, let me ask you, is that going to happen?
Well, it's not, at the Congress, the Senate is, there are 19 Democrats up and 15 Republicans. There are 5 open seats, which are most likely to go. They're all Southern seats. So my best guess at this point would be that the Republicans probably pick up 2 seats, 1 to 2 seats in the Senate. The House is about 228, but actually it's 233 because of the Texas reapportionment. We do this analysis of what seats are most likely to flip, and I don't think there's enough seats to flip, so I think the Republicans will hold the House and the Congress, the House and the Senate, they'll hold. The presidencies are going to be real close. States, Arizona, Ohio, Florida, those are the states. There's a set of states that Democrats can take. They're leading in those. I just looked before I came up, state-by-state polls, and Kerry's leading in the Electoral College. But Pennsylvania, Iowa, Minnesota, Nevada, Florida, they're all close and could go either way. So I think the most likely outcome is probably divided government.
Yeah. Let me just add one final point. If I were a Democrat, and I pretended I was one for a while, it's kind of fun, I would move heaven and earth to win this election this fall.
Go ahead.
Joe, let me ask you about one of the part of the fallout from this, I think. Bush came in saying that one of the things he wanted to do was to raise civility inside the Beltway and restore dignity to the White House. Now he has a White House, we're told, where Colin Powell doesn't talk to the Vice President. And you've written about the situation in which civil political conversation is no longer possible. What's going on in Washington and in the country?
You know, I wish you could all see the cover of this book by Nelson Polsby. And what it shows is a committee in the old days. It looks like probably a House committee. And what they have here is a long table and Democrats are sitting on one side, and Republicans are sitting on the other side, but they're facing each other. And I once asked Bob Michael, who is Newt Gingrich's predecessor as the Republican minority leader in the House, when things started going downhill in terms of civility in Washington, he said, when they build all these fancy committee rooms where the Democrats are all the way over here and the Republicans are all the way over here, and you never get to look at anybody in the face and talk to them. One of the reasons why I've written that I would have really liked to have seen, and maybe, who knows, it could still happen, I would have liked to have seen John Kerry pick John McCain and have John McCain be a Republican on a government of a national unity government that would be composed with a cabinet that would be proposed of moderate Democrats and Republicans, was because I think that if there's a crisis in this country, I mean, the situation, the foreign policy situation is very, very serious. But I think that if there's a real crisis in this country, it's that we just can't have a civil conversation anymore. It's happened over the past 20, 25 years, actually over the past 40 years. There are a lot of historical reasons for it, in part, you know, after the South went Republican, the parties stopped being coalitions and started being more ideological, and then you had the rise of a press that wasn't skeptical but cynical, and the rise of political consultants who made their money by, you know, creating bumper stickers and the most extreme sort of advertising. And then you had, over the last 10 years, people like me, but not me, screaming at each other on television. And all of this happened during a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, when the actual differences between the two parties were utterly minuscule. Now, we're in a situation where there are some really big issues on the table, and we can't begin to have a conversation. So I would have liked John McCain and John Kerry to get up there and say, look, we disagree on abortion, and there are some parts of aspects of Iraq that we disagree on. There are a whole bunch of other things. But those aren't as important as changing the atmosphere that we have in Washington now, and trying to have and by the way, this is on you guys. Maybe not you guys, because you look like a bunch of political junkies, but I think that, you know, I named a character in Primary Colors after this concept, Orlando Ozio. Machiavelli said that Ozio, indolence, was the greatest enemy of a republic. What he was worried about was how you keep a republic coherent when it was not at war. And we've had this unbelievable experiment in affluence over the past 40, 50 years. And during that time, we have lost the habits of citizenship. And I think that we're going to have to regain them and have a really serious election this year about very basic questions. And I don't know that we're up to it.
No, let me just comment on that, because I've got a little list here of some of the things that people have been saying, and you're right about it. You want to talk about the various consultants. Talking about the various consultants, I would agree with you. However, let me just read you a few quotes. Robert Byrd, the Republican is at its greatest danger in its history because of this administration. Because of this administration. Bill Moyers, I think this is deliberate, intentional destruction of the United States of America. Some guys down in Florida. We should put this, he's talking about Rumsfeld now, we should put this SOB up against the wall and say, this is one of our bad days, and pull the trigger. And John Edwards says, Bush is the most radical and dangerous economic theory to hit our shores since socialism. Since socialism, wow. But my favorite is this one by Janet Reno. Asked what Democrats can do about the Republicans, Janet Reno recalled her visit to Dachau, concentration camp, and points out the Holocaust happened because many Germans just stood by. And don't you stand by. Now, with that kind of virulence out there, we got a problem.
Marty, they were all Republicans. You know, I remember listening to Rush Limbaugh the day before the Wisconsin primary.
I'm talking about elected Republicans. Not journalists.
I remember listening to Rush Limbaugh the day before the Wisconsin primary, and him saying that the only reason why John Kerry had won the nomination was because of a swimming accident in Vietnam. Now, you know, there's no way you can defend that kind of nonsense. And I think that one of the grave mistakes, one of the reasons why I kind of have, you know, I'm not a big fan of Al Franken and Michael Moore and all the rest of them, is that I don't think that the Democrats really need to go to the level that the Republicans reached during the entire Clinton administration. And during that time, you could go to many things that Tom DeLay said about the President of the United States, especially in times of war when it came to Kosovo and other places. And last I checked, he was elected. But I think that there's plenty of blame on both sides. I find both sides and the extremists on both sides despicable. I called the ads that MoveOn.org had put on the air, especially one about the $87 billion, morally atrocious in my column a few weeks ago. You're not going to get me argument from me about this, but it is not coming from one side, and there has been a long tradition, starting with Newt Gingrich, who said politics was war without blood, mainly because he had never seen war and didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
That's an ad hominem attack.
Well, there's
You promised
a
not
modest
to do those.
He did not know what he was talking about because he had never seen war. I think that there's a long tradition that has to be broken at this point.
Yeah. Let me just say.
And the last two speeches, of course, were perfect examples of how to break it.
Right. No.
I mean,
Let me just add
I was bipartisan. I attacked both sides.
Yeah. So
And they need to be.
The point is,
Just one final thought. Look, I'm sorry, just one thought. If you think this is bad, go back and read the history of the late 1970s, the late 1700s, when Thomas Jefferson was running. And those guys used to shoot each other, literally. So I think what we ought to do is have a lot of free speech, and I'll tell you what the final answer is. People are going to ravage each other, both sides, in this election, and you get to decide.
Let me ask you a few questions about Bush's policy, about specific policy issues, if we might. And Dave, maybe we can get you and Susan involved a little bit here.
I'm not sure I want to be involved.
I'm just taking notes.
I'm copying her notes.
Susan, you've covered Congress. Ted Kennedy recently accused the administration of discounting information that doesn't support its policies. It's not surprising to hear such a charge from Ted Kennedy, of course, but there have been similar charges recently from a group of leading scientists, that he doesn't like facts that don't fit with environmental policies, similar charges in other policy areas. The administration actually withheld the actual cost of the prescription drug care bill program from Congress without the debating the meaning of the word is. Is this unusual in Congress dealing with the president?
I think this is hardly the first administration to finagle the figures. So let's at least start with that. The question is whether this administration is more severe and more egregious in the manner in which it's misled Congress. I'd be very interested to hear Marty's assessment of that, compare it to the Reagan administration. Sure. I mean, compare it to Nixon. I mean, let's get some historical perspective here. Is this administration far off base, or is this administration par for the course? And because of what Joe says, because we are no longer civil in how we discuss it, sure, and because the purpose of so much of the news media is no longer to inform but to entertain, I give you my former colleague and friend Chris Matthews, who I think is one of the smartest people in Washington, but I can't stand listening to him anymore because the decibels are so high. So sure, I think I would like a scholarly answer to the question.
Well, let me just comment on part of it, which I read the story about this guy at HHS that withheld the correct numbers. They're about $150 billion more than that was sent to the Congress. And my reaction was very simple. They ought to find out who it was and fire him. I mean, just out the door quickly and find out who else knew about it and fire every single one of them. That's outrageous. It's unacceptable.
This doesn't seem to be an administration that's very big on firing people or admitting mistakes, though, is it?
Oh, let me see. I think, well, I don't know.
Well, they only fire the ones who actually tell the truth.
Well, Now, John, now that's a second ad hominem attack.
No, I'll give you, that's not ad hominem, I'll give you the details. Paul O'Neill told the truth about the impact of tax cuts, and Larry Lindsay told the truth about the cost of the war. In fact, he underestimated it.
No, and let me say one thing about that, because I happen to know Paul O'Neill, and I know Lindsay, worked with him for 2 years during the Bush campaign. And the reason they fired Paul O'Neill was because he had policies which were not in tune with the president's. And what he said in his book, he did not write the book, someone else wrote the book. And most of what he said is absolutely wrong, and he's since reneged on the book. And as far as Lindsay goes, that is not the reason why he got fired, and I won't go into why he did get fired.
Right, but go to answer my question.
Yes, I'm
How
sorry.
does this compare with is this a more egregious administration than others we have known?
Well, in terms of actually stating false data, like that case you mentioned, I'm not sure if I can recall any. But let me put it this way: any cases you can recall are bad. They just shouldn't
David
exist.
Stockman comes to mind.
Yeah, well, you saw what happened to David Stockman, and he got mad and went out and hired himself a speechwriter, and he wrote his book. Incidentally, by the way, in terms of books, the Woodward book was a big interview with Colin Powell a few hours ago as I was driving in here, in which he just beat down most of the bad stuff that Woodward said, sorry, I was there, it didn't happen.
Well, actually, I heard that same interview, and I'm about halfway through the Woodward book, and what Powell was talking about were two specific claims in the book.
Big ones.
No, they were small ones. No, it was whether or not Prince Bandar had been told about the war plan before he was. That was one of them, and then there was another that was equally small. But he didn't dispute the most basic fact, which was, because he couldn't dispute it, which was that he was far more reluctant to go to war. In fact, he was pretty much against it from the start, and had deep disagreements with both the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President.
Okay, now let me tell you what Powell really said. What he said was...
Can you do it
that
very quickly, please?
Sure. He argued against the war and wanted to take it to the United Nations. And they agreed on a two-pronged approach. They would take it to the United Nations, but if it didn't work, then they would go to war. And they took it to the United Nations, and the United Nations, for the 17th, the 18th time, didn't do anything. And he said what they did then was exactly the right thing.
Let me ask you about recently.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry.
Susan, did you want to say something?
Well, doesn't it just, as a matter of common sense, strike you? I wish I was trying to tell my students about this earlier and think of all the names of people who have, secretaries of state in particular, have resigned on principle. At what point in this affair do you imagine Colin Powell might have stood up and said, you know, this is a policy that I cannot abide. I'm not sure I can go to the UN, and I'm not sure that I can continue to be in this administration. And I find it so duplicitous to, on the one hand, be a source for Woodward and tell him all this stuff, and
That's exactly
then
right.
on the other claim to have been out of the loop. I think, I don't know, moral cowardice.
Well, he doesn't claim to be out of the loop.
He doesn't claim he was out of the loop.
He doesn't claim to be out of the
Well, of
loop.
course he doesn't claim
But
to be out of the loop.
Susan's point is a really legitimate one. It hasn't been, Cy Vance resigned over the Carter's attempt to rescue the hostages. I think Cy Vance was wrong in that case, but it was an honorable act. Here you have a Secretary of Defense who's been wrong about everything, who's been absolutely wrong about everything.
Everything.
And who said that we were going to be down to 30,000 troops in Iraq as of last June. That was his prediction. Who believed this guy Ahmed Chalabi. Did anybody see The Tailor of Panama? Ahmed Chalabi. And we're still, the question I would have asked the president last week was, here's this guy Ahmed Chalabi. We now know that most of the information that we got on weapons of mass destruction, the most spectacular stuff, came from his shop, and it was all wrong. And in fact, he's taken credit for it. He said, I am a hero of error. And we're paying him $350,000 a month. Now, Mr. President, why?
Well, let me give you the answer to that, seeing as you asked the question. My simple-minded understanding of this is that the main source of intelligence to President Bush was the CIA. And they checked with a lot of other intelligence agencies around the world, the French, the Germans, the Israelis, and they all were convinced that these were these so-called weapons of mass destruction. In fact, if you believe, I think most of Woodward's book is probably right, but one of the interesting quotes in there, and you probably remember it, is that when he was briefing President Bush, and President Bush expressed concern, "Are you sure? This doesn't sound right." And he supposedly raised his arms and said, "It's a slam dunk." So that's where the intelligence came from.
Right. But the most spectacular claims, the nuclear claims, the notion of the mobile biological laboratories, that came from Shalaby's brother-in-law. The notion that there were labs underneath the main hospital in Baghdad. Many of the most spectacular claims, including those that were retailed by the vice president even after the CIA told him that they were untrue, came from the INC. If you talk to British intelligence, if you talk to Israeli intelligence, they will tell you, and everybody believed, that Saddam Hussein still had stocks of biological and chemical weapons. Everyone believed it. But the most spectacular claims came from the INC, who we're still paying $350,000 a month.
One last question, then it'll be your turn. Bush recently held his third primetime press conference of his presidency. It's about one a year so far. Far fewer than any of his recent predecessors. And the assessment of his performances were not glowing. Many people still say, however, that the press has been too easy on the president. Susan, anyone else who wants to respond to that? Has the press been going too easily on the president?
It's always hard to judge how the press is on the president by the White House press corps. Joe was kind enough to begin talking about this with my students earlier this evening. The White House is almost as bad as the campaign bubble, the airplane that travels with the campaign. So that's not a place to look for courageous reporting. I think, though, you can raise the question about whether anybody in the press has asked Bush the right kinds of questions, questions that would elicit useful responses for the people we're supposed to be informing. That's one. And number two, and I can say it with more confidence than I otherwise would because we see so much of how it works now in California. And it began, I don't know, I guess it began with Nixon, perfected to some extent by Michael Deaver and Reagan, and now perfected to a T with this president and with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is the president in Hollywood, or the main, in our case, the governor in Hollywood, where the president, the governor is here, the press is here, there is no connection anymore whatsoever between a press corps acting on behalf of the citizenry and eliciting information from the politician and what is a staged event for television news.
I noticed all those examples were Republicans. Is that also true of Democrats?
It is true of Democrats, yes, I'm sorry.
I think that as a member of this press corps, I think that we gave Bush the benefit of the doubt at first, in part because there was a reaction, an almost subconscious reaction to the degree of scrutiny that was given to Bill Clinton over things that turned out to be not that crucial. And then there was a very legitimate period, a second honeymoon after September 11th, when the country was united and horrified, and the president behaved with, I think, what everybody would agree was, was inspiring leadership for those, the first weeks and months afterwards. I think that the press is caught up now, and that, the decisions, the budgetary decisions, the regulatory decisions, and the foreign policy decisions that the president has made are under, fairly classic and responsible scrutiny at this point.
Can I just add one thing to what Joe said, otherwise I'll forget it, and that is the effect of 9/11 and anthrax and the bizarre coincidence of the Washington sniper on the Washington press corps, and you can sense it if you go to Washington from someplace else and realize that your former friends and colleagues now are frightened in a way that we can only dimly appreciate being here on the West Coast. Something about the result of having been in the line of fire did something to the press corps, something about having plans in your desk from your editors that say what to do when the next attack comes, changes the mentality of the press.
Well, let me just, as unaccustomed as I am to defending the press, I just think that's totally wrong. My experience with the press is that working under incredible time schedules, unbelievable things they have to research and find and write, I'm amazed at how much they get right. Look at these books coming out. Read the Woodward book. Read the Clark book. All the books on both sides coming out. That's part of the press, too. These people, 99% of them, I'll even include this
Clark's not
guy
a
here,
reporter.
are honest and they're tough and they report very, very accurately. And I say that as someone who's been on the other side and talked to them and watched what they published. Now, maybe you can prove what you say, but that's a terrible charge to make against the press. And then one last point.
Maybe
We have-
this is strange. This is only a Berkeley event. Marty Anderson defending the press and Susan again. See, Carl, I think we should just quit and go home now.
They may not let you back there.
We do all kinds of crazy things down at Stanford.